Hello all, and for this one, I think I want to start off with a little story of personal experience, if you will. Um, when I was a kid growing up, I was a really shy, frumpy, uh, quiet, uh, but generally regarded as a intellectual kid, even though I had problems off and on with my own performance. My teacher still considered me quite smart, very eloquent. I never had problems with English or anything like that. And I would say whether it was nurture or nature, whatever the case may be, I definitely had some kind of proclivity to words, trying to be a wordsmith, incorporating it into my day-to-day dialectics with everyone around me. And as a kid, kind of in the schoolyard, you have like some little brat running around, trying to speak the king's language, if you will. Other kids are gonna, pick on you for that because it's different, and there's kind of resentment involved too. Like, hey, this kid's using more, he has a greater sophistication and penmanship than me. I'm gonna, shit on him. I'm not saying that if I was in different positions for my own resentments, it's not like I'm some holier than thou figure, and by any stretch, I have my own shame complexes as well. But this is my own experience as a kid, and one of the things being biracial, if you will, is reflecting back, there was always one of the things that was always used as an insult on me at school was like acting white, when I would display kind of uh, good penmanship, I guess, or I would have better vocabulary than they would. And so they would just cast me off as white. And I think looking back on these think pieces that are arising about biracial whiteness, they're kind of they don't really know what to do about this kind of emerging minority within the minority, if you will, of people realizing, hey, this the representation that we have is a false path, as I've kind of alluded in the canon of these videos. And I guess to really summarize, I'm on an intellectual journey, if you will. I've been undermining postmodern thought, using postmodern thinking, the Deleuze and Foucault. I've been quoting all these important thinkers that undermine Eurocentrism, or casted it off as a problem, if you will. But when, as I've pointed out, when left to their own devices, ultimately they go down further along the path of Eurocentrism, because if you want to call it a paradox, I guess, only a bunch of Eurocentrics would, be frantic about their own Eurocentrism, I guess, would be kind of a coy joke to summarize that white universal video. And I guess if you want to get Hegelian about it, as he kind of points out about, these kind of resentments and this pursuit of power, when you get power, when you do obtain it, but it was out of that resentment, what will be left? And I think that's the question I asked at the end of Quantities of Color, is when these left-wing resentful minorities supposedly overtake the white dominant class, what will be left, as they've kind of defined their own culture and signifiers based off of this racial resentment. this problem with an antagonism to their own environment, which I think is actually, rooted in, nihilism and self-loathing and self-depreciation, as I, talked about in the, Deleuze's conception of the eternal return for Nietzsche. You can't change the dice throws that happened prior to you. There's a history prior to your own ethnicity. And, I guess this is kind of like an introduction into this video, because I wanted to, change it up a little bit and, brush up on one of the more edgier people in political theory, and that would be Carl Schmitt. And I've alluded to him on this channel before, but I think what Schmitt offers, obviously there's his politics, which could be left to desire, in hindsight, but that still doesn't take away some of the things that he pointed out to us that could be useful. And I think there's two things in particular that I want to hone in on for this video in particular. One is, of course, Schmitt kind of brushes up on what I've pointed out before with, there's this kind of theological energy that's been put into our politics now. And, it comes from that. And so, there's, from my own perspective, as this kind of, multi-ethnic, Americana, people that's kind of emerging in the background that I don't really think people acknowledge enough, or it's in the political climate, this is obviously, if anyone major actually saw this, I'd get canceled probably. This coddled nanny state approach to racial minorities in America fails to take into account the actual decline of these people. You look at the black community, for example, compare that to, Harlem in the 20s, and the lifestyle and, the relationships. Thomas Sowell, one of my favorites, of course. I think that's, any based minority, right, is always going to, defer to him. And, I have a lot of, I might not, I think there's an issue in a vacuum that could be formed, because, when you kind of get red-pilled on, this left wing attitude towards you, when you actually, I think there's a resentment that actually forms by this, betrayal of, the democratic politics. And, I don't think it's organic to just defer off into this kind of capitalist, free market, libertarian ethos that, I myself experienced. And you kind of look at the based minority kind of category online and its presence. And I'm not saying, I'm not, calling out anyone in particular, and I don't want to act like, we're all, we're all on the fringes here at some point. So I don't want to punch right, but I actually want to, ask, something along the lines of, are we ourselves actually demonstrating this same sort of resentment because of, something like the bamboozle concept that, someone like Carl Sagan would point out when he says that about, the secular, rationale worldview. But, I think, when it comes to being bamboozled, and, if you gave something, a long period of time to this kind of truth and you get red-pilled on it all of a sudden, you are cracking away at someone's, grounding. And so, there is actually, it's kind of seen as probably pretty cringy if you don't actually read any of these people, but, there is this kind of thing that Nietzsche should just come with like a warning label or something like that. And to some extent, yeah, I think it is true. Red pilling people is actually a dangerous thing, because you are tampering with someone's, grounding for what they consider reality, at least in a political form. To just pull that out from them and, offer no alternative, right? You're just, deconstructing, just like the postmodernists did. And what did that give us? An anxious, schizophrenic, mentally ill, generation that followed. And ultimately, as, those postmodernist thinkers started to die off and they were, like, actually seeing the fruition of their ideas, it's not like they actually supported them, I think that would be a fair assertion to make. So, just like how one of the great men of the West, Descartes, when he says, "I think, therefore I am," a lot of people kind of callously point out how, we don't really know how to think anymore. Back then, thinking was a whole different thing, a whole different experience than today. And as I was kind of saying in Quantities of Color, this call for representation, this call for justice, this call for freedom, which are ultimately these Eurocentric concepts to begin with. We don't actually know how these things really operate or work. We just know that we kind of want them, and that's what we've been told in the classroom that we're supposed to strive for, and that's, this kind of liberal worldview of that's how everything, every bit of our, kind of material retention, if you will, comes from these concepts. And that's not necessarily true, because, as some of the other thinkers that I quote all the time have been pointing out, a lot of this is actually foolery. It's based in nothing. It's actually the fall of a kind of like theological, representation of things, of a kind of centrality of that. And now we just have these obscure political abstract, think tanks to represent ourselves. But, what's the actual quality of it? What does it really matter? It is kind of interesting to consider, if you really strip away the resentment of the politics of the policy that they're trying to put out. A boardroom full of strong, empowering women. What if they hate women? Most women actually do, I think, in my opinion, hate other women anyway. I know I've mentioned that, and I actually do get a lot of nervous laughs from women when I point that out. A lot of them actually kind of light up to that when I say, yeah, I don't think most women like other women. And in, private, they'll admit that. And I think that's true for a lot of these, left-wing demographic, loosely conjoined around this ideological scarecrow of the male and the patriarch and the whiteness. This is when you kind of press them alone, you realize that they don't actually have any idea to sort of empower themselves by any stretch. It's just based on these calls for representation and this like presence of perspective, if you will. But it doesn't actually necessarily mean that you're gonna achieve anything with it. And so, just like I've been, saying, it's a faux path. And, what do we actually make of that? And so, obviously, as you kind of looked at the persona of the based and red-pilled minority, he has these talking points that I think are kind of even left behind now. One of the problems with this kind of like politically correct climate, if you will, is you can't even assert necessarily that because ultimately this is the universal state. This is a universal global empire now, but obviously the kind of like Anglo perception of things would have an advantage because it stems from that culture. And I mean, ultimately what I'm saying is not very controversial at all I'm doing is just flipping it and saying, instead of just ranting about white privilege all the time, what do we actually make of that, because we're always having to overcome our own backgrounds anyway in the end. I think in that, as I've been talking about depressed men, and there's these kind of matriarchal, if you will, in nature answers to these political problems now, because women are doing well politically. And for men, men don't care about validation. We want results. We want problem solving. We actually want problems in a way. That helps us literally try to contend with our own suffering. But just sitting around and asking for the validation of you being wronged in some historical context, that is very passive energy, very compassion driven. And while there is a place for that to some degree, I'm not saying that women aren't women are obviously going to be drawn to that, but for men, whether they want to hide it or not, that's not going to be good enough for them. And whether they suffer silently, which overwhelmingly that's what we will choose to do. That's why we don't show up to therapy anyway. It's because we know that validation truly isn't the road out for us. We kind of intuitively know that. And just like I think we, as this kind of biracial minority group, we intuitively know that we don't really have this kind of like historical canon to reference back to kind of ground us, to kind of give us this sense of discovery of who we are. It's kind of broken up now, and so people with the same kind of perspective or the same kind of yearning and feeling, we can't even really go to each other to express it because of the nature of the political atmosphere. And I think that's really disappointing, and not really surprising, because there's obviously a lot of political ramifications for why it is worth noting that, as I kind of pointed out in that cancellation of culture video, whether or not you think white culture is evil, or where your thrownness, if you will, if it's some inequity, which it most likely will be. There's no denying that to some extent. Ultimately, to just flounder around and not try to take in, where you are grounded ultimately anyway, which is this, Eurocentric thought. You speak English, you're taking part in this language that, predates you by a millennia. And so what, ultimately those thinkers and those people who, took part in that language found interesting is going to definitely have an impact on your own political theses. And so just saying, blah blah blah, white man, I'm gonna run off and do this kind of like nihilistic attitude, which is still, a concept all of its own. It's ad nauseum. It doesn't go anywhere. So, yeah, it's just kind of in that same spirit of undermining the fact that the relativists, it's simply just relativism out of the sake of relativism. It's not actually taking in these perspectives. It's not actually the quality of this representation. It is the quantity of it. So, telling these people that 15 women are on this corporate board of some kind of power structure, it's not even so much that it's 15 strong and empowered women. They could care less. It has more to do with 15 less males, 15 less whites, 15 less of that ideological scarecrow that I talk about. And as I've just kind of beaten on the left here, I did kind of want to brush up on what is the prospects though? What do you make of this though? And it's kind of run off to these libertarian talking points of that really don't kind of have a apolitical perspective on the crisis of everything that's the degradation, if you will, of everything around you. I mean, that's one of the things that I personally left libertarianism for, is you kind of just would rather stay in your own private island and preserve that, as opposed to trying to perhaps find something more, and to actually look out for other people and to give them a kind of way of dealing with all of these antagonistic institutions around them. And I think that's something that's dearly and greatly missed for these like radical missing biracial people who turn to these kind of politics, turn to these ideologies to really belong, similar to the kind of church pew, if you will, and that kind of togetherness, and that bond of brotherhood that a kind of racial hegemony used to have, but is now stripped away. And this isn't to say that it's all in some totality, right? We continue to kind of strip away at these as these different modes of being kind of brought around like a center, if you will. We keep stripping away from it, and I want to help actually build something back up that is resistant, that's just not going to be toppled over again, the second someone asks, like, why are we doing this anyway, and what's the point? And I know this is kind of went off the rails a little bit, but I figured this would be a nice little follow-up. Thanks for watching. I guess just to kind of wrap this up though, the second kind of interesting thing that I find about Schmidt that I wanted to apply to this video is, as I kind of pointed out in Quantities of Color, there's this attempt to form this internal proletariat, as Toynbee would kind of describe it, as I talked about in my last video, to kind of combine together all of these minoritarian groups of the low together against the white middle class, or the male middle class, and ultimately being used as kind of a battering ram to preserve the highest power. And I think when you kind of have this perpetual, fear of the white male, and how hysterical it could really frenzy up these people into being. One of the things that Schmidt obviously is famous for is kind of the state of exception. And so when you have this kind of perpetual scarecrow, this ideological engine, if you will, of, quite literal fear of this demograph, then, you will be always willing to let the state, tap into that exception that liberalism tries to, avoid showing, but ultimately has to maintain itself. And that also plays into kind of the resentment of this kind of minoritarian politics is they don't necessarily get, because they're shielded from learning their place in history. Liberalism is ultimately kind of the obfuscation of the desires of what the state and these power structures really want to do but can't do because we don't like authority as a culture. But yet we're the global empire. So, yeah.